I hope everybody's doing well this morning. I know that it's been a long summer, and that's kind of an intriguing thing to think about. Is it really fall in the South anymore in September? And I'm going to say probably not so much. And that really does have an impact on essentially what happens with plants and how plants behave, and then of course how our storm systems are going to roll through here. So you think about trees. Obviously I love trees, and that's my area of study and interest, and has been since I was a child. So it's cool to be involved in something that you've always loved. Plants are amazingly adaptable when you think about it. These are bristlecone pine that have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So they've adapted to this very specific type of environment. And that's really important, because as climate changes, how are these plants going to respond to these changes in the environment? It's pretty amazing that plants can actually grow in just about no soil, or in some cases in the out of a rock. This is called the witch tree along Lake Superior. I've actually seen it. It's a little bit over 300 years old. So not quite as old as the bristlecone pine, but still an amazing plant and something of great significance to the Native American culture up there. So, you know, it ain't always easy for a weed to grow. I don't think that's actually true. It's often quite easy for weeds to grow, as you guys might know, and are always trying to get them under control. But it is a testament to how tough plants really are. Joshua trees in California and baobab trees in Africa. Just amazing, amazing structures and amazing organisms. So I always liked showing a little bit of maps. This is the predictions of climate for temperature in the century 2071 to 2099. And if you've been listening to the news lately, of course, they've changed some of the predictions, and they have met recently. And so they are quite worried that we're going to hit that 2 degrees mark within the next number of years, a little bit faster than I think we originally thought. So the issue is you've got more gases trapped in the environment. So all those heat gases, because all of the gases that keep them in are kind of lost. And so that's a pretty significant reason for why our temperatures are changing. So although there are many kinds of storms, I'm going to actually focus on hurricanes primarily. It could certainly be heavy thunder and rainstorms, because flooding is going to be our biggest concern, particularly with trees. Tornadoes, you're not really going to be able to prep trees to prevent issues with tornadoes. We can do some things with minimizing ice damage and things like that, but I really wanted to focus on the flooding caused by hurricanes. So certainly a lot, again, some more kind of dire predictions in some ways is that they're talking about a 2 to 11% increase in wind speeds, along with 20% increase in precipitation rates. So that means we're going to have a lot more per year, potentially, more hurricanes per year, and sometimes they're going to be more extreme as well. So the higher sea levels, of course, are going to be huge issues for our coastal communities, all up and down along the Atlantic seaboard. So, and certainly Florida and places like that, as well as the Gulf Coast. So a 1 to 4 foot rise in the next century. So think about what we've already lost and what we can potentially continue to lose over time with a lot more storm surge. And then obviously that means a greater potential for damage. So how are trees affected by all of this? And that's really a very complicated issue, actually. It's not just so straightforward. So I wanted to share with you just a couple of things that happen in the trees and in the soil that can lead to a tree declining. And of course, I wanted to tell you how resilient trees are, because it seems like they can tolerate many, many things for many years. And we're kind of very lucky because of that, because we can have trees around longer than you would not expect them to be. So you're going to have these very acute soil and tree changes. They're going to happen fairly suddenly, and then there will be things that happen later on. The acute changes are primarily due to saturation and inundation. So that is essentially what's happening, and how long does that take place? And so the characteristics of the flooding is really important, and I'll address that in a little bit. So there's also other things happening. You have all these depositions as the floodwaters recede. You have organics different sediments, all kinds of chemicals in those sediments. And so those can obviously affect living things fairly directly. Of course, we all know that things get knocked over in a storm like that. If it's not the wind, it can be that saturated soil situation that scours the soil away from the tree roots, and that tree to soil root kind of relationship is hugely important, and that's what keeps trees standing, along with some other characteristics that we know about trees: large root plates, wide, large root plates, and just the taper of a tree, how they're formed, is really important, and what keeps them standing up. So then you have that acute thing, and then you have potentially these chronic problems over time. So I'm going to talk with you about a lot of chemistry here, and try to just bear with me. It's not, I want you to understand what's happening in the plant and why these things happen. So when respiration occurs, O2, or oxygen, is the electron acceptor, right? So that's how the plants actually respire, is using O2 as the electron acceptor, right? But when you have a flood, you have less oxygen in the oxygen in water, and so the roots are essentially being suffocated. But while that's happening, other things like nitrogen, manganese, and iron are going to become the electron acceptors instead of oxygen. And what that means is that you can have a buildup of manganese and iron in particular that leads to toxicity in the plant. So the plant can maybe adapt a little bit, but again, how long does the flood go on? So they'll have trouble then over time transferring electrons, because the tree has the same amount as the soil does at some point, right? So once that starts happening, then the next thing that happens is sulfur becomes an electron acceptor. And so I know you guys know what sulfur smells like, right? So when you have sulfur in fermentation, kind of respiration, then you have this stinky, kind of slimy soup, and trees are not going to survive well in there. So when you have sulfur in there, you also have hydrogen, which can form hydrogen sulfide, and that's very toxic to plants, right? So all of these things become insoluble and unusable. And again, with no O2, fermentation occurs. And when that happens, carbon is the electron acceptor in that case. So what that means, though, here's the interesting thing, is fermentation it consumes about 20 times the amount of food for the same amount of energy produced. So think about the stored reserves in a tree and how those are lost much more quickly if you have fermentation respiration occurring. And then all of these alcohols and fatty acids and phenolic compounds and sulfur and such are formed too, which again are toxic to plants. You know that methane and CO2, hydrogen and nitrogen gases are formed, and they escape as gas, and those toxic bubbles can actually affect the health of the tree as well. So the cool thing is those trees that are flood tolerant have developed methods of getting rid of that, some of that fermentation, some of those compounds, right? Expelling them or changing them chemically inside the plant, which is really kind of amazing. But the problem is if fermentation continues, you have root stress, you have root death, and then you have these anaerobic organisms that are respiring and consuming carbon from the actual dying of the root cells. So hopefully you guys are still with me. That's the worst part of this morning. And we'll get into some other things now. So damaged soil structure, that makes sense, right? We talk about aggregation as being a very important part of how plants do well and survive and thrive in our soils and our landscapes. You'll also have the coatings that surround these soil colloids and clay are dispersed. So that means you have less nutrient holding capacity and less potential water holding capacity, which is not necessarily a problem in a flood. Certainly leaching of some of the essential elements can happen as well. And so when you have organic matter broken down again by the anaerobic bacteria, you have that kind of partially decayed kind of form of nitrogen and sulfur, again, that doesn't smell very good. And it actually occurs at less than half the normal rate of respiration. So the plant is obviously not functioning well. So what does it happen in a plant? It really depends on what stage the flood occurs. And certainly it can happen when they're germinating, sprouting, they're elongating in growth. And that actually, when it is in the warm season, that's the worst time to have a flood. and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. But so photosynthesis, of course, shuts down because the enzymes and stuff that makes everything work is no longer working. And then eventually you get leaves starting to turn yellow. Then they'll have maybe a premature fall color. They'll die or get old, and then they'll potentially fall off. So of course, with no leaves, we got no photosynthesis happening. And so everything is operated within the plant by hormones, and sometimes we call them growth regulators. And the problem is that you really need oxygen in order to allow those things to be manufactured in the plant. You also need this little thing called nitrogen. Without nitrogen, you have no enzymes, no hormones, no proteins, no nothing going on in the plant. And so flooding leads to those dysfunctions. So what else? This is pretty cool, right? Again, the resiliency of trees. This is a willow, and it was flooded for a long period of time. And you can see what actually happened is up at that top layer, that's where adventitious roots were formed. And even on the branches that were stuck in the water, adventitious roots were formed. And that's pretty cool, but not all plants can do that. So you have, again, reduced root growth and possibly death and decay. And keep in mind what happens a lot of times with Phytophthora, right? You have a plant that potentially was drought stressed in previous years. Now we get flooding, and now we've got the perfect environment once those flood waters recede to have Phytophthora root rot take over and cause the plants to die. So interestingly enough, the plants actually become more prone to water stress after the fact. And that it's kind of an interesting concept to think about, because you think, oh, there's all this water, but that's not actually what's happening. So we know that mycorrhizae are really an important relationship that roots have, particularly in the uptake of nutrients like phosphorus, and of course bringing in more water. So if we have the mycorrhizae suppressed, then that's certainly going to potentially affect the health of the plant. So obviously things like siltation, sedimentation, and erosion occur, dumping stuff in places that it was not before, and often on top of trees and root systems. And that's really obviously not a good thing over time. So it depends on how long it stays on that plant. So obviously you could potentially have tree failure. And again, that's because the soil has potentially eroded away from the root systems. Obviously, the force of water is a pretty impressive, powerful force, and it can be quite much stronger than air. So even though trees are built to sway in the wind and hold that root system down, that displacement of soil aggregation and just loss of soil in general and a water-logged soil can lead to trees failing. And so you can have a lot more issues, obviously, particularly along water courses and such. So, you know, I talk about this idea of sediment covering plants from flooding, and I wanted to show this. This is not from flooding. This is from something that we do to plants in the landscape. And so one way to prepare and to care for trees ahead of time is to not do things like this, right? So planting trees correctly, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but planting them and protecting trees from construction that compacts soil, and certainly from adding soil to the root crown of a plant like this will certainly lead to death and decay. There are ways to mitigate that, but we want to avoid that if at all possible. So as I mentioned earlier, growing season floods are the worst, more so than ones that happen in the dormant season, especially if the temperatures are really high, because the tree is going to actually dehydrate faster. Now, that may seem weird with all that water around, but the problem is that the root system is now dysfunctional. So with the dysfunctional root system, the plant is not pulling transpiration water through the system quite as well. And so if that happens, then the plant is essentially drying out inside. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but when you think about it, it really actually does make sense. So again, because all of this is happening in the growing season, things are already going on where that plant needs a lot more oxygen and it's not available. It's going to need to maintain itself in a different way, so it has higher respiration needs. And so this is why we're potentially going to lose foliage. And so certainly the quality of the water is really important. When you have more stagnant water, that's going to become a bigger issue potentially than if it is kind of flowing. So in general.
Barb, just a quick
Sure.
question. So a lot of times these plants, after they've had flooding damage, will wilt, and people will think they need more water, but in
Right.
actuality, because the roots are dead and they're not getting the water in.
Exactly. So, you know, I've had a lot of, and this, I'll just throw this in here now. I've had a lot of calls from some extension agents and some folks in the public who have had trees that seem to up and die. And it is unlikely that they've just up and died. What we think is going on, there's no plant pathology at this point for some of these trees. What we think is going on is a dysfunction in the xylem of the plant. So when we have these really hot, dry periods followed by really wet periods, we end up with the same result, right? We have a plant that may wilt, but the reason it's wilting is not necessarily because it's too dry or too wet. It's because what's actually happening is the plant is no longer functioning well. The root system is not taking up water well. And when it seems to us the plant just finally croaked, even with all its leaves on, what likely happened is that xylem finally just, whatever was left of the xylem that was functioning finally kind of kicked off. So that's a great point, Charlotte, that yeah, let's not add water to a plant. It really has to do with the dysfunction in the root system. And
Right.
so it's kind of a cool way of looking at it. But
Yeah.
yeah, how
And
do you fix it?
so your slide view, when you first shared, it had full screen, but now it's gone to kind of presenter view. So we're
Oh,
seeing
okay.
your notes in your
Oh,
next
okay.
slide, just so
All
you know.
right. Let me do it this way.
There we go. Yep, there it
Sorry
is,
about
back to
that.
full screen. No problem.
Sure. All right.
We were getting a sneak peek of
Getting
what
all
was to
of the
come.
information ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, we think about what really predisposes plants to decline, death, and failure. Well, that's certainly some of the important ones right here, right? We do a lot of mass grading in developing communities. I don't know any way around this actually, because developers are always going to want to make the most money that they can, and I understand that. Can we preserve places? Yes. Is it more expensive? Yes. So it is going to be a challenge to try to mitigate tree decline due to compaction from development. So I just like to show this tree on the right here, at least on my right, where you can see how compacted the top of that system is right there too. And so this tree failed in a storm event. Now this was a microburst, and again, microbursts are sort of like tornadoes in that there's not a whole lot you can do to prevent them other than keeping the trees healthy and well pruned, and I will address that in a second. But I like to show this because you can really see how deep these root systems are. They are not much deeper than 3 feet at most, unless it is a longleaf pine. And you think about where longleaf pine grow in sandy soils that are in sort of hurricane prone areas. And so that's certainly why they've adapted a root system like they have. But most species in this part of the world do not have extensive tap roots like that. So not going to be able to hold themselves up. Then we do all of these kind of crazy things in our urban environments. Now, we want trees. I love trees. I want trees as many places as we can have them. But we have to recognize when we're putting them in very small sites, we are greatly limiting the root volume and therefore how much nutrients and water that plant can actually take up. And so these are calorie pear on the left, certainly not something I recommend planting anymore, but still they are really tough trees and can survive in an island like this. On the right are Zelkova in Washington, D.C., and they are beginning to decline. You can see a little bit of hint at the top of some leaf browning and some early fall coloration. When I was in DC not too long ago, a lot of their trees are in serious decline. And again, they have a changing climate there as well. A lot of gray infrastructure surrounding these trees and certainly limited root spacing. So we know we can put them here, we know we can get away with it for a while, but then we have to expect that there may be issues in the long term because we have set these trees up essentially for failure and stress. So this is just an example of a tree that was planted, again, was kind of too much soil around the base, the bottom of the plant, but also you'll notice it may not have been planted quite correctly. You'll see some likely what were probably girdling roots. Wherever you see something that goes kind of straight down into the ground, you can expect that there may be trunk girdling roots on that plant that were not dealt with at the time of planting. And so that is something we really need to address. Certainly some trees are better adapted to flooding. And bald cypress, there are certainly some, tupelo and things like that. But again, it still depends on the quality of the flood water, how long the water stays around. Because if there is no means to drain that water off or get that water away from the trunks of the trees, they will still be impacted. It just may not happen as quickly with those trees that are tolerant of that kind of flooding. So a couple examples here, of course, bald cypress. When you think about some of the best ones, and again, these, it goes back to picking the right plant. And this is something we talk about all the time. And I think even though we talk about it all the time, I think sometimes we just don't really believe it, right? We say it, we talk about it, we tell everybody to do it, and yet we still make bad choices. We select plants that maybe are not the best for a particular site. I understand why we do it. A lot of times it's done because we want to make sure that we have a uniform landscape, we have design components that we're trying to address and stuff, but some of the species that research has found that really do well, and I selected ones that I know will grow in North Carolina. And they got this information from a little case study that they did. The Journal of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry has a companion journal. It's the Arborist News, I think. Anyway, it's more of a trade journal. But they had folks kind of call in or write in and say, here's what happened in our community after this flood. So you had, or after this storm event. So you had Sandy. Some folks in New Jersey and New York kind of responded. And so they had certain tree species that would work really well in their area. And I thought, well, which of those might work here? So kind of pulling and choosing from different parts of the country what works well that I know may work well here, but obviously not in every case. I know a lot of people may not be familiar with Gymnocladus dioicus, the Kentucky coffee tree. We don't always plant it here because it does tend to prefer a higher pH soil, but we found that actually it can do quite well and is a little bit more adaptable to that. So you'll see there are certainly native and non-native species on this list. Most people are not going to plant Morris species or mulberry, but certainly, and again, none of these are perfect species, but certainly these are some ideas of what will potentially grow. Populus deltoides, that's actually on a lot of hit lists in communities where you're not allowed to plant it because it produces so much seed. But there are certainly other plants that we can use. And so you'll see, juniper was a surprise for a lot of people, that juniper actually did so well in some of these flooded situations, as long as the flooding didn't last for significant periods of time. Notice Thuya plicata is on this list. However, Thuya occidentalis is not, because that one is not a plant, oops, sorry about that, that's going to actually do as well under flooded conditions. So some that they suggested not. Now, Acer palmatum is a really tough tree, actually. It is very drought tolerant, but it is not so much flood tolerant. So we have some cedrus species that seem to do pretty well, and that don't do as well. And then, of course, interestingly, the Leyland cypress, which to me gives it another reason to stop planting that baby everywhere, right? So certainly something to think about. I was surprised that the tulip poplar made it on this list. They found it did not do so well. And certainly some oaks will do well where others may not. So Quercus stellata, that's a picture of it up in the upper right-hand corner. That is post oak, in case you're not familiar with that species. So, but post oak is a great tough tree for really terrible soil. And in really dry conditions, that plant may do really well. So obviously one of the things that's really critical important to get your clients to understand is not only the importance of selecting the right plant, but how do you assess and modify the site if you have to. One of the most common problems in our urban landscapes is compaction. So how can we mitigate or minimize compaction? Certainly minimizing it means we're not bringing a lot of equipment on there, we're not doing mass grading, which may not always be possible, but even people walking on a site actually causes compaction. And it doesn't take but one pass of a large piece of machinery to actually compact the soil if it's wet. So one of the things certainly is if you have to work on a soil work on it when it is drier. Farmers know this, right? If you go on it when it's wet, you're going to have much greater potential for compacting the soil. So again, how much organic matter content? And I'm going to tell you that is a big issue these days. I see these recommendations for what I call designer soils, where they're recommending 30% by volume organic matter be added to a clay type soil. And my concern with that is most native soils only have 5% and can grow trees quite well. So I don't know why we think we know better than Mother Nature, but I guess we do. And so more is better, right? That's always the argument, but it's actually not so much, right? So we have to know what kind of organic matter we're adding. Because if you add 30% by volume pine bark and you get it wet, it's going to stay wet for a long period of time. And I actually have a research study in looking at that. And I've had trees actually not perform well at all in that kind of designer soil. I mean, losing foliage early, not growing well, not producing good foliage the following season. So there are long-term issues with making the wrong choice when we actually start at that site level. And you'll notice this is a table that Jim Urban, who is a landscape architect and taught himself about soils and is now a certified arborist, kind of created, and it gives you an idea of how much soil do you really need to get a tree of a certain size. Now, if you only want a tree to get 12-inch diameter, then all you need to do is supply about 800 cubic feet of soil and the tree should be fine. But if you want it to get larger than that, or it has the genetic potential to get larger than that, then we actually are going to need to give it more space. And so something that he always talks about is let's plant the easiest spaces in the urban environment first, where we don't have to do a lot of modifications. One of the biggest issues, and again, I see this all the time, is where trees are not protected. You know, you see the tree protection signs up everywhere, right? And the big fencing. And I often see those fences get shrunken in a little bit, where now we're really violating the critical root zone, which again is within the drip line of the tree. And we pile stuff inside the fences. It's like, well, that looks like a good place to store equipment and pile all of our construction materials. Not so much, right? We're now compacting the soil. So we really want to minimize how much root system we're cutting. Both of the trees in these pictures, and if you look at the bottom one, you'll see it actually kind of get a hint of it, but every tree along that street had the roots cut like that in order to put down a new sidewalk. So what's the stability of those plants? I'm going to tell you, it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when those trees will fail. And so in those cases, sadly, it may not take a storm of any magnitude to cause those trees to fall over. So we've created a hazard ourselves, and that's something that we should be able to avoid. If we need to do work like that, in those cases, I hate to say it, if you've got this sidewalk tree conflict, it may require tree removal in order to mitigate, you know, raised concrete and raised pavement and stuff like that. And I do know of some communities that actually have had to make those tough choices. They, for example, there's a place in Ohio, they planted bald cypress all along the street. And it was about a 4-foot wide tree lawn in that case. And bald cypress can really grow. In most situations, it grows really well. And so these trees grew amazingly well. And in a very short period of time, they began to push up the sidewalk. And of course, in many communities, the homeowner is actually responsible to pay for the sidewalk, even though the public right-of-way goes behind the sidewalk. So it's kind of a catch-22. But in this case, the city planted the trees. They knew they made a mistake, and they ended up having to go in and take out all those trees. But imagine you had 20, 30-foot tall bald cypress that were actually absolutely gorgeous that they had to remove. And so now we're kind of starting from scratch. So again, it goes back to picking the right plant and understanding how plants grow and how tough some plants can actually be. So keeping those trees protected like that and making sure that we have the whole drip line in the system, in that protection zone. So another way to protect trees, if you have to drive over the root systems, is you can pile up about a foot or so of wood chip debris on top of the root system. It's not going to stay there very long, and it does certainly help mitigate compaction. The other thing is making sure that if you're on a site, and say you're building a new home in a wooded area and you're trying to protect those trees, we want to make sure that everybody that's out there knows what's going on and how important the trees are to the client. And so the guy who's putting in the utility lines or the irrigation lines or the cable lines, and if these are going to be underground, everybody has to know where they're going to go, and everybody does it all in the kind of the same location. So we minimize how much impact we have on that root system. So the root system and its integrity with the soil is the most important factor in minimizing how much damage can happen from storms, particularly wind and rainstorms, and if you get a lot of ice on the branches, again, depending on when it happens. So certainly planting is hugely important, correct planting, because if you have these trunk girdling roots, and sometimes they do come from the nursery like that. A lot of nurseries are working very hard to minimize that. The key is in a nursery situation, they have to begin cutting those roots every time they upcan. From a seedling, they cut them till they get to the next, the 1 gallon, to the 3, to the 5, on and on and on. Each time they have to make sure those roots are going out horizontally, not going down, not going up, and not going around. Circling roots out the edge of a container grown root ball can usually be addressed at planting, but oftentimes, especially, and it can happen in ball and burlap trees as well, you may not see where that trunk girdling root is. And so this is what ends up happening. You will have a dysfunction along the way, and that tree will fail. It will fall over. And a tree of this size can certainly do a lot of damage. And so we kind of set ourselves up for this potential failure if we don't plant them correctly. So don't bury the root collar. Certainly make sure that we're planting where you see that first main order root, which is the first root that comes off of the root ball, whether it's a B&B or container grown, that should be just below grade. That root should be just right at soil level, or just a little bit of soil on top of it. A lot of people say, well, how about planting them 2 to 3 inches high? All right, that's better than planting them a foot high. But I've actually seen a lot of trees in recent years planted a foot or more above grade. And the problem with that is then we apply triple shredded hardwood mulch to that, and which is hydrophobic until it gets wet. So where does all the water go? And you guys have heard me talk about this a lot before. All that water just flows right off of that root ball, and none of it's really penetrating into the root ball. And so those trees are going to experience some sort of water stress at that point. And certainly, if you see them remove the girdling roots, and there are planting techniques that I talk about, and I do have a video that shows how to do planting of both of those.
And so, Barb, I'll drop that link in the chat, but also we have a question, and I think exactly what you're talking about is addressing the question about, are there ways to plant trees in urban areas for better success, particularly along streets? And do you recommend any references? So the person said the city of Raleigh and Virginia Tech have some good references, but do you have other, especially online extension references you would share?
Right, so certainly the videos that I have produced show you how to do planting properly. I don't have anything specifically. I need to pull some in from some other resources because there's no need for me to reinvent the wheel. Actually, if you want some great information, if you go to the University of Florida's website, or you can just Google a guy named Ed Gilman, G-I-L-M-A-N. Ed has done a ton of research over the past 20, 30 years. He's now retired, but he had a huge site and a lot of money, which is awesome when you want to do tree work, because it takes a long time to get trees to a good size. But he's done a lot of work on pruning, particularly. He's got 2 great pruning books if you're interested in tree pruning in specifically. And then he's done a lot of work on planting. And so the guidelines that I follow in my video are based on a lot of his research-based recommendations, right? So I do hope to put together a smaller fact sheet that just gives you some of the real basic ideas for how do we plant B&B, how do we plant container grown. Container grown typically takes a little bit more manipulation of the root system to make sure you've gotten rid of the edge, those circling roots, and somewhat mitigate girdling roots if you can. You can't always see them. So there are, we do these shaving methods, and we do kind of these radial slicing methods. So yes, the answer is yes, you can plant trees in urban areas to be successful. There's a number of different things people have been looking at in the past few years. There is structural soil. Structural soil is made essentially of large chunk kind of gravel. It also has a little bit of organic matter in it, and sometimes it also has a smaller component of permatil. So sometimes the big gravel chunks are actually permatil. Sometimes they are a gravel source. It just depends on where you are. In North Carolina, they're most likely permatil of a few different sizes. And so then it has a sticking agent, and they mix it in a cement mixer, and then they pour it under the sidewalk. The point of that is that you can put sidewalk on top of it, and the soil is not compacted. It is not soil per se. That's why they kind of call it structural soil. There's not really any mineral component to it. But permatil has a really high CEC and water holding capacity, so that's great. And they did some of these in downtown Raleigh. They planted, I think they were overcup oak on Fayetteville Street. And they went in at about 4.5, 5-inch caliber to me, which is a little bit larger than I like to see planting. But they grew astronomically in this first 7 years. So I think the things are twice that size now. Now, it sounds like a great success story, right? And I believe it is, but we also have to understand that because of the nature of the structural soil, they have also had to irrigate and fertilize more than they would have if they were trees growing in typical topsoil. So that's one thing. And then you'll see the Silva, SILVA, is another method of doing this. And you can also put concrete around those. And by the way, the structural soil per tree is about $10,000 to $15,000 a tree. Okay, that's a lot of money. Silva are about $25,000 a tree potentially. So they're a plastic kind of baskets, so to speak, that can stack on each other, and you can pile them as deep as you want and as wide as you want underneath the sidewalk, and then you plant the tree in there. And a lot of times, again, they're using a designed soil for those sites. Personally, I'd rather see them use regular, good old topsoil, right? We've gotten away from this idea that topsoil is good stuff. We know it, but a lot of these designers are making soils that are really high in organic matter, but also just potentially very not as long-term as a typical soil, and can be much more costly to put in. So there are ways to do it. I'd like to see us, if you can create an extended tree lawn rather than tree pits, that's a much better way to do it. You can also put what they call root canals or root channels that are made with a material, a heavy-duty plastic or metal material that can help hold the sidewalk up, but then roots can grow in between those where it's not compacted. So you certainly can actually do a lot of cool things to have trees grow in those urban areas. So one of the things, hopefully that answers that question. But so again, if we see a tree that's not performing well, how can we find out what's going on? And one of those things is we can do a root collar excavation, which is done with an air knife or an air spade. You need a large air compressor to do it. I've done it with the students. I've done it for research. It is actually a lot of fun for me. Most people find it fun for about 5 minutes because you get dirt in every orifice that you can possibly imagine. Because obviously it's blowing dirt around at a very high rate. But notice the cool thing is you can expose the roots without damaging them, and you can go in and deal with whatever girdling, trunk girdling, or circling roots you might have. And you can use these to create, if you have to put in a utility line underground and you have significant trees, instead of cutting the roots, you can expose those roots and you can put the wires underneath the root system or weave them in. So obviously, I'm all about planting trees where we can plant them. And so obviously in our urban areas and along stream banks and in the forest, these planting trees is going to help mitigate storm and climate issues in the long term. That is certainly one fairly easy, fairly inexpensive things that we can do all over the place. And that means creating or maintaining more green and open space. That's really important. As I mentioned before, again, can we create tree lawns? Can we create areas that allow water to infiltrate? That's hugely important because when you have these flooded areas, and you guys have heard about Houston lately, well, Houston built unfettered. They did a lot of development and built a lot of infrastructure and a lot of gray hardscape everywhere. And so they have created a community that is not very infiltrative to water. And so you can see the kind of issues that they have. We have to control how we do development if we want to allow water to move away from these systems. I know that's not an easy thing for a lot of folks to want to hear in politics and in the development community, but it is really what we need to be looking at. We certainly also want to think about how we're redeveloping in areas that have been hit by storms, and that's a big topic and a really complicated topic I'm not going to talk about here. One of the things we need to do prior to that is risk mitigation, all right? We have to understand plant trees away from structures. You know, people after a storm, they want to come in and they want to cut down every surviving tree that's left because they're afraid it's going to fall on their house. I get that. And a lot of times some guy comes along with a chainsaw and says, I can take care of that tree for you. And a lot of people will do it out of fear. So one way to avoid that is let's plant them far enough away from the structure if we can. And again, picking the right tree so it doesn't rise too far above your house. And potentially, essentially not having a target for the tree to fall on. You can, in some cases, move targets. You can restrict use in certain areas. Pruning. Can't say enough about pruning. We do not do, nobody does. Campuses, cities, homeowners, nobody does enough young tree training. And one of the videos I've produced does show you how to do some young tree training. It is incredibly important in mitigating potential storm damage, particularly from very typical weather events, wind, rain, and such, ice storms, which we don't always seem to get here, but certainly in the mountains they do. So thinning and crown cleaning, making sure we're taking out the dead, making sure we don't have codominant leaders, getting the canopy up above, a little bit above the street, wherever we need to get it, and that's often based on the city requirements. You can do crown reductions. Pollarding is a way to reduce a crown without topping. Crown reduction can also be done without topping if it's done correctly. So it is incredibly important, the young tree training part, because you can help minimize further damage. And one of the things you have to avoid are these codominant stems. And I think I have a picture of those in a second here. So installation of structural support. A lot of people have thought about this. Some communities think that if you're doing that, you're just drawing attention to the fact that you have a tree that might be at risk. But certainly you have to get the right company that knows how to do this. And it's not like wrapping a wire around 2 codominant leaders and calling it a day. It's got a lot more to it than that. Lightning protection, certainly a big thing for really important, significant, large, old trees. Modifying the site. Growth regulators. A lot of people don't like chemistry, but a growth regulator is essentially applying a hormone to a tree that slows down its growth. It actually can have some great benefits. It actually can make the plant more drought tolerant because the leaves are smaller, they tend to be thicker, and they tend to have more chlorophyll in them. So it's an interesting thing. If you don't know a lot about growth regulators, you should certainly look them up. So the trees that are most likely going to have risks, it makes sense, right? It's the older, more mature trees, especially if they have not received training when they were young. We're looking to mitigate and eliminate codominant stems with these bark inclusions when they are small. When they get big, they're going to fail. It's just a matter of when. If you have trees that have cracks in them, if you have a crack, the tree's already failing. So it's something that needs to be taken down most likely in most cases. Root, trunk, and limb decay. Decay is one of the #1 reasons for branch failure in a tree. It may not always be obvious on the outside, but it certainly is something that could be happening inside. Really long branches that are growing really far. Now, live oak, that's normal, right? Live oak can grow down and kind of rest on the ground. But so something to think about is how long are those? So you want to look at, what branches have like maybe poor taper. Are there old pruning wounds that might have some sort of other compounding injury? Have there been bad pruning cuts that mean there may be decay inside the plant itself? So kind of thinking about, what we have in the tree. So obviously this tree is already failing. This was a sawtooth oak. On the right, yeah, this is a Callery pear, so who cares? But it does have targets around it, so huge issue. Callery pear can be pruned from the time they're small, not to do this, but let's not plant them, period. So you look and you see these bark inclusions. You can see where you have a little bit of decay material forming there. And again, a lot of that is bark. Bark does not grow into bark. Bark is dead on the outside. So you end up with these codominant stems that have bark inclusions, and they will fail. Regular inspections, making sure you have somebody come out and look at your trees. Hire an arborist to do that if you don't know what you're doing or your clients don't know what they're doing. Have them hire a certified arborist to come out. Certainly cities are trying to be this more proactive because it is a much less costly to do it that way than if you have to go out and do crisis management. And sadly, there's always crisis management that's going to happen because a lot of communities can't get out and about and do that young tree training. I've tried to tell them that the cost is going to be much more cost effective to prune them. Hire the people to do that. Use a shade tree committee. A lot of those folks are volunteering. They can go out and make pruning cuts very quickly on young trees. And when they're planting the trees, I tell them, if you're not getting a good quality tree, number one, get a good quality tree. Number two, if you have to prune at the time of planting to fix that. So that was a yellow wood that died, that was broken in one of that microbursts. So this was one that went down after just a typical thunderstorm. It didn't take a lot, but notice the amount of wood that's involved in one of these failures on these large trees. And that's because it was a codominant stem and it had a bark inclusion in it. So again, if you are kind of just going out there willy-nilly and letting things happen, then you're going to be set up for potentially a lot more injuries, death, property damage, and lawsuits. And so this is certainly something that I tell all of my city folks, we need to be looking at this differently because there's all kinds of research and data on how much it does help with budgets and overall health and canopy of that city. So I'm winding down here a little bit. So after, this is just to show you, after an ice storm in January, this is way back when, but they found that those trees that were much more well-maintained, a lot of them were less prone to damage. So 84% of the damaged trees had pre-existing defects that could have been avoided with proper pruning. This I cannot stress enough. This is our mission right here, is to do good pruning when they're young. So if you don't know, and your folks, you guys know, but you got to tell your folks, contact a professional, not just some dude out there with a chainsaw that thinks they know what they're doing. They should have liability insurance. They should be bonded. Ask for references. All of those things are really important. As I said, decay is the most common predisposing factor. This tree may not have looked like it had decay in it from the outside, but an arborist would have probably seen signs that meant that there was a problem. They can use this cool equipment. All of these things are incredibly expensive. The resistograph and the sonic assessment, quite a few thousands of dollars to do that. And then certainly, as I mentioned before, a root crown excavation can tell you what might be going on. And of course, this tree in the bottom has some telltale signs that there could be decay in there, but how deep does that decay go? Just because a tree has decay does not necessarily mean it needs to be removed. So kind of keep that in mind. And if a tree is stood up after a hurricane, that says that's a pretty awesome tree, and maybe we should be more inclined to keep it around than get rid of it. So again, we know all of these practices work. We just have to be better at employing them. So right tree, right place, site assessment modifications, proper planting, proper pruning, proper pruning, proper pruning. And of course, regular inspections and assessments. Planting more trees and certainly protecting our coastal area. It may not mean with trees, but it certainly means with plant material where we can protect those, the dunes and such. So, and again, increase infiltration, minimize gray infrastructure. There are communities out there doing it. This is a picture of Portland, Oregon. They get rain all the time. They have a ton of infiltrative surfaces out there in these little parks along their streets. We need to do it because we get a lot different rain than they do. We get a lot more rain at a very quick place. So we need to do more of this than even they do. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that we have time for. And there's my info. You're always welcome to call me, or certainly email is the best way to get me, because I'll always get that and get back to you. So thank you guys for your attention.
All right. If you have a question for Barb, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute your mic and share it. I was just thinking, Barb, do you know, is there a correlation between trees that tend to stand up well in ice storm to trees that stand up well to, say, hurricanes or strong winds?
Well, I don't know if there's been any kind of research done to look at those two things kind of directly, but certainly, you know, usually what you have in an ice storm is branch failure is the first thing that's going to go. And again, having good structure, strong structure in a tree means that you have broad branch unions, not those V kind of unions that end up with bark inclusions in them. So removing them when the plant is young. Again, not topping trees. We talk about that all the time, but people still do it. If you're topping trees or pruning incorrectly, you can have very bad branch attachment. And so you have branches that may be attached to a very thin layer of cambium cells, and that's it. And so they grow 20 feet in a season sometimes because they're sprouts, essentially. And so those are going to be more prone to failure, certainly from ice storms, but certainly from any heavy winds. So when you're talking about the toppling of a tree or the failure of a tree at the root system, it's probably not quite as likely with an ice storm as certainly it is with a hurricane because of the level of winds. So there has been some research done on loading of branches and how much wind it takes. Ed Gilman has actually done some of that work. There are others. I think a guy named Eric Kane, and I'm not sure, I don't know if he's in Virginia Tech anymore or not, but if you are interested there, you can go to the Journal of Arboriculture. If you go to the International Society of Arboriculture webpage, if you're not a member, then you can access archived journal articles. And so it allows you to search by subject name. So if you're really interested in some of these concepts and want more detailed research-based information, that's a great place to go to look at that. So I actually am putting together some information about flooding and drought. I already have a publication out for drought, but certainly on flooding and kind of what we've talked about today, what happens with plants and such. So yeah, you have to have that strong root plate in order to have a plant be able to withstand heavy winds. And it has to have a canopy that has some opening so the wind can blow through there as well. Not too much opening, but enough to kind of resist, you know, kind of a reduction in the wind resistance.
Excellent. So I've added a link to the Journal of Arboriculture in the chat, and all of the links I shared to Barb's, the wonderful videos Barb has, and the Ed Gilman resources will be included in the follow-up email that goes out today. But there's one more question in the chat about, from Tom Gale, I have a large oak. Would it be beneficial to remove the smaller trees around it to allow more water infiltration?
Great question. Actually, no. So, you know, you think about how trees grow in the forest. Yes, they do compete with each other for water and nutrients, but they also have been found to help each other a lot. So large trees have this amazing ability to do what we call hydraulic lift, which means because of the forces of transpiration, they're actually able to pull water from lower down in the soil system and bring it up to the surface. So the young trees can potentially benefit from that ability of the larger trees to do that. And so the young trees are not going to compete as well with a larger tree. So really taking them out isn't going to do a lot for you. It's like the same concept when you think about pruning. If you take out a branch that's kind of dead or kind of declining, not doing very well, not thriving, it doesn't do really anything to help another branch that's doing well. So again, depending on what your purpose in pruning is and what your purpose would be in removing those other trees, it's most likely not going to have any impact on whether or not you I just would say no, don't take the trees down. It's not going to help with water per se.
All right, and last question is, when is the best time to prune little gem magnolias?
Okay, little gem magnolias. So I do have information on pruning, and if you're really interested again in tree pruning, Ed Gilman's book is great. So you can prune them. A lot of things I would recommend pruning in the spring. So once new growth has come out and hardened off. We used to talk a lot about dormant season pruning, and I'm not telling you that it's not right. It's just not as good if you have to take off a lot of branches and you're making cuts that are larger than a 2-inch diameter. So if you're removing branches bigger than 2 inches, then you should wait and prune in the spring after the new growth has come out and hardened off. You can look at the tree without the foliage and decide what you might want to prune off later. It's the same thing with woody shrubs, really. So they're going to be a little bit more forgiving than larger trees. But so if you think about it, when you make these cuts in the dormant season or even at the end of fall, the plant is no longer growing at that point, right? The top growth is really stopped. So you still have root growth, but the problem is those wounds that you've made are not going to close over until spring and when you get new growth. So potentially you've opened up this wound and allowed oxygen to get inside the plant. And having oxygen inside the plant actually means that there are some fungal organisms that have already gotten in there too that may now germinate and become active. So you could have interior decay that you weren't aware might happen. Even with a good pruning cut, they're still going to dry out. So you really want to wait. It is a bigger pain in the butt, sort of, because you have a lot more vegetative material you have to throw through the chipper or whatever, right? So it's easier to see and look at them with no foliage, but it is actually better to do that pruning in the spring. So for Little Gem, let's prune it in the spring after you got new growth. You could probably do a little pruning on it over the summer if you still need to make some adjustments. But again, always asking yourself, why am I pruning this plant? What will be the response of the plant when I prune it? And I have revised the pruning publications that Lucy and Anthony and I have written, and I'm going to be getting them out there hopefully in the next couple weeks back up online. So a lot of plants listed in there about and when to prune them and how to prune them.
Wonderful. Those are excellent publications, so it'd be great to have them. I put a link to like an older version, but it's great to know the new versions, updated versions are coming out soon.
Yeah.
So thank you, Barb, for joining us this morning, for sharing your expertise, your knowledge. Thanks for all the resources you create for all of us across the state to help us do a better job and to help us teach people how to take care of trees and keep our communities healthier and keep our trees healthier and promote all the benefits that trees bring.
Happy to do it. Thanks so much for inviting me.
All right, excellent. You're welcome to stay with us, but Barb, if you want to, as we switch over now to Matt Bertone and Mike Munster, who are going to bring us some be on the lookout for pest and plant disease updates for this time of year. So I'm gonna call. Yep, there we go, Matt.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you, Barbara. That was a great talk. All righty. Well, I'll go first, and I think Mike should be on. Let's see. I see him on.
I am indeed on.
Great. All right. Let's see. So this month, well, since we've been splitting up the months a lot more for our Bolos, we actually have some kind of continuation from last month's Bolos. So I'm just going to reiterate. I actually had a very nice vacation last week at the beach, and I actually saw a mating pair of Carolina mantids. And so this is the time of year that you're going to be seeing these big insects, big spiders, especially the big orb weavers that have only one generation per year. The wasps and the hornets are going to be really active. So basically it's the last push until the end of the season when everything starts to kind of die out. Get those eggs laid, get them to overwinter, everything like that. Other things I mentioned last time were the blue-winged wasps, Viscolia dubia. They're going to be out looking for large white grubs to parasitize in the ground, and so they may be out at this time of year as well. Fall armyworms in lawns, again, late season, they're traveling up from warmer areas and they're pretty well established here, so you may see some damage in lawns and such. Goldenrod insects, the goldenrod is starting to bloom, so you're going to see a lot of any of the fall blooming flowers are going to have some good insects on there. Bagworms, this may be a time of year, especially when the trees begin to, and bushes start to thin out a little bit, you might find those bagworms and remove them. Remember to cut the silk at the branch and not to just rip them off or detach them, because that silk will girdle the branch afterward if it's not removed from the branch. Lastly, peach tree borers may be laying eggs near your prunus. So look on the ground near these trees, and they might be flying around. They're these wasp-looking moths, and that can help. Looking for them may time treatments for the caterpillars before they enter the plants, and at that point, they're going to be difficult to treat. Now, new thing is, as it starts to cool down, end of September, beginning of October, middle of October, before our next session, you may start seeing stink bugs coming into the home. So they'll hide out in different places. They're going to be more actively looking for overwintering sites. And along with the stink bugs, especially the brown marmorated stink bug shown here, and this one is hiding in my window blinds from last year. Other things may be things like ladybugs. Ladybugs will also overwinter as adults, and so you may see them. And if you do, they may come in large quantities. And basically, for both these types of insects, if you see them, they can be removed by hand. They can be vacuumed up. They can be put in buckets of soapy water. Note that the stink bugs don't bite, but they can stain the skin, and they do have a smell and odor to them when they're defending themselves. Ladybugs can produce chemicals out of the joints of their legs that can stain the skin, and they actually in high populations have been known to bite people. So just even though they're cute looking, they may be a nuisance, and severely so. And that is all I have for now. We'll give you more updates in October when we have our full session, Mike and I. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of the warm days, and we'll see you in October. Okay, let's see. All right. How you doing, Mike?
We see your screen, Mike.
You can see my screen now?
Yes.
Oh,
Bolos
okay,
for
great.
October.
Great. So let me start out with the thing I know the least about, which are turf grasses, but I depend on the list that Lee Butler gave me a while back of what to look out for on turf grasses month by month. Things are starting to shift over, or hopefully they will, into cooler weather. And we'll be seeing, since in cooler weather, it's the warm season turf grasses that get stressed. That's when we'll start to see problems. But starting off here with really fairy ring, you see down in the lower right, that occurs on any turf grass in pretty much any time of year. Remember that these can be rings or partial rings. They can be areas of dead grass in the ring, or you may see the green, as you see here, as the fertilizer effect from the passage of the activity of the fungus there in the soil, or you may actually see the mushrooms and puffballs coming up in the ring. So there's different types, they're called, of fairy rings, type 1, 2, and 3. So be on the lookout for those in just about any kind of turf and any kind of, or any season of the year. Again, since the warm season turf will beginning to be stressed, large patch is going to continue to be a disease to look for. And at some time in the fall, I'm not familiar with the details, but the infection is going to occur that's going to lead to our spring dead spot coming next year. So those are areas that you won't see yet because it's the actual cold injury in the infected turf that ends up showing the symptom. Leaf spot on bluegrasses and especially Bermuda grass caused by the fungus bipolaris is something to be looking for. And rust, as you see in the picture on the upper right there, the little pustules with the dry orange to yellow spores in them, could be happening on your Kentucky bluegrass, your fescue, your St. Aug, and your zoysia grass. As far as our shade trees and shrubs, you'll be seeing powdery mildew on a lot of different things, as we have been late in the season. Again, Phytophthora and Armillaria root rots, those are on the list just about every month because the symptoms can show up even if the infection was active earlier. Now, what's curious about this time of year is that with Armillaria, you may see the fruiting bodies. It forms a true mushroom in clusters. They're rather honey-colored. One example is given there in the upper right photograph. but this does not always occur on every infected tree every year. With Phytophthora, you will not see any kind of fruiting bodies. It doesn't produce them. We have to do a lab test to diagnose them. And for armillaria, again, the usual method of diagnosis is quite destructive. You have to have the base of the main stem or some of the largest roots to be able to peel off the bark and look for the presence of that mat of fungal mycelium between the bark and the wood. As we talked about before, Cercospora leaf spot on your hydrangeas, pretty much any place that those are grown here in the state, you may be getting inquiries about that. So keep those leaves cleaned up and hopefully reduce a little bit the fungal inoculum for next year. Nematodes are hidden thieves in the soil, especially boxwood and azalea could be suffering from these. So when you see decline, don't forget that there may be something going on there under the ground besides root rot. This is the time of year now in October where you may be seeing conchs of wood decay fungi. Barbara showed a couple of those in her photographs of the trees with decay. They are a sign that there is some kind of heart rot going on inside the tree, or as you see in the lower left picture here, that's my foot on the side there, and that thing that looks like a loaf of bread rising before being baked is actually the fruiting body of Pseudoinonotus striatus, which causes one of our most important root and butt rots on hardwoods, especially oaks. And that's one of the diseases where we can get structural loss in the wood and wind throw during storms. So when it fails at the root system, this may be one of the factors. I was curious, we had that microburst storm a month or so ago here on the Dix Hill property, and they were showing some of the trees that had fallen. I was curious, but never followed up to try and get over there and see if those trees had evidence of decay before the microburst. Entomosporium leaf spot on Indian hawthorn and on any red tip photinias that there may be left in the landscape. If you see the bright red spots with the little grayish blisters, fruiting bodies there are quite small, but you can see them under a hand lens. That tells you you have Entomosporium leaf spot. And again, if you're at the planting and shrub installation stage and you want to put in Indian hawthorn, recommend people look for some of the varieties that are less susceptible than others. And finally, on our BOLO list for October, boxwood blight. And I'm going to just, we've got a minute, so I'm going to actually ask if there's any volunteer out there who wants to say or type in the chat box what they know to be the 3 key symptoms for diagnosing boxwood blight. I know we've gone over this on the program before, and I've said that if you have any 2 of these 3, then that really pretty much seals your diagnosis, although of course we do like to see it in the laboratory here. Occasionally we could get fooled, but most times 2 out of 3 of these will tell you what you've got. Are there any volunteers? Let me open the chat box again. I'm not seeing my chat.
Do we have to put all 3, or can we just put what we know or what we suspect?
Let's see if anybody wants to go for the hat trick and get all 3.
Got some coming in now.
All right, leaf drop, single branch dieback, leaf drop, black cankers. All right, so we got 2 that agree on leaf drop. Black streaking on stems, there we go. And very close, Gene Fox. I'm going to give, well, no, branch dieback. We don't really see that as quite as one of the things. Splitting bark, that's more cold injury. All right, well, several of you got 2 of the most important ones. You can see in this photograph here, the leaf drop, the defoliation occurring often from the lower part of the shrub up. Also the dark streaks on the green twigs and those brown leaf spots. They can get a little bit lighter in color when they get older, but and they occur either at the margin or not at the margin of the leaves, but it's the brown leaf spots, defoliation, and dark streaks on the green twigs. Those are the things you're looking for. If you're seeing just individual branches dying back, then you want to look for a possible canker or sometimes root problems that are affecting a portion of the root system. I was afraid that we were going to see a lot more boxwood blight coming in following Hurricane Dorian. I hope that folks east of us here weathered that storm all right. We'll wait and see if that rain event will trigger a lot of more boxwood blight. So far, we haven't really seen that happen yet, though, so that's good. Moving along then, things are kind of fading out in the vegetable garden. But if you still have basil, be looking for downy mildew there, Cercospora leaf spot on any beans. And on the cucurbits, the picture in the upper right there is from my vegetable garden this very morning. A lot of powdery mildew there on that squash that we still have around. We still have a few squash on it, and my wife is still picking flowers off of it to cook up. So if you do have cucurbits, you're likely to be seeing powdery mildew yet. And as the cole crops go into the garden, be looking for a couple of diseases. Black rot, pictured in the lower right there, the yellowish leaf spots, often in a V shape, but not always. And that's definitely something you want to be careful to avoid purchasing if you're buying your transplants. Notice also you can get some of the veins involved there in the leaf symptoms. White leaf spot is a fungal disease of turnip. That's something that may be coming as well to the garden. And with our fruits and nuts, pecans would be the main thing in October that we'll still be keeping close track of. And so scab, a fungal disease on the leaves and the shucks, is something to be on the lookout for. Flowers and perennials, just late season decline from low nutrition. The fertilizer load is running out, and also the accumulation of foliar diseases. Again, root knot nematodes that may be causing problems under the soil line that you're not aware of. Powdery mildew on a lot of different things, such as sedum, such as ironweed, such as zinnias. With your liriopes, remember that importance of the winter haircut to remove those tips that have anthracnose on them and reduce the amount that you'll have in the following year. So you'll maybe seeing that occurring now, as well as if you see an entire plant die, you could have fusarium crown rot or possibly even Phytophthora crown rot. Peonies leaf blotch, measles, I mentioned that again, even though we've mentioned it before, because now this is the time of year when you want to make sure that those remaining dead leaves and stems on the herbaceous perennials, the peonies and the irises and so forth, are removed once they're senescent to avoid letting those disease or those pathogens, excuse me, accumulate for next year. On zinnias, apart from the powdery mildew, you may be seeing some alternaria leaf spot and some of it getting up there on the petals and making the flowers look unsightly. And as we start putting our pansies and violas in, keep an eye out for Phytophthora root and crown rot, black root rot, which you see pictured there, which tends to cause more of a yellowing as opposed to the kind of wilting and collapse that you get with Phytophthora and Pythium, which would be another root rot disease. So far, I'm happy to report that we haven't seen too many problems in the clinic here on the pansies that our greenhouses are producing. So hopefully it's going to be a good year for those. For better or worse, we bought some this weekend, but I don't want to put them in the ground just yet with all the heat that we're still having, because those will be more susceptible to diseases if the weather is stressful to them, aka under the hot weather. So with that, I will take any questions.
If you have any questions for Mike, you can put them in the chat or unmute your mic and ask them. With the pecan scab, Mike, I've always understood that is often what can cause the shucks not to open properly and release the pecan. Can you confirm that? Because that's a question, especially when I was in the eastern part of the state, I used to get quite a bit about the pecans not actually falling off the tree.
Let me check that real quick. I think that, I don't know about keeping them on the tree, but let's see, there's a good publication out of Georgia on pecan disease control. Let's Let's see.
Or maybe like the whole thing falls off the tree, but the shucks are still attached to the nut.
Let's see, it does reduce yield. Okay, if scab infects the nuts in the early stage of development, the pecan may fall off. Scab can cause leaf loss and also produce black lesions on the pecan shucks anytime during the season, which can reduce nut size and therefore yield. So early season infection, the nuts can, or the whole thing can drop off. And then late season, getting the nut size reduced.
Okay. All right, I know, especially in the eastern part of the state, there'll be a lot of pecan questions coming in later in the next month or so. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. So thank you, Mike and Matt, for all your great tips. We know there's still several weeks left in the growing season, so lots of things to look out for. I'm going to go back and share my screen. And just talk for a few minutes about our feature tree, our feature plant for this month. I hope everybody can see the bald cypress. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Slide, okay, thank you. Slide with our bald cypress. So I know I've been featuring a lot of herbaceous plants, but woody plants are extremely important for our landscapes and for our ecosystems. And with our focus this month being tree care with storms in mind, I chose bald cypress because most types of storm issues, this tree is really resilient to. So flooding definitely handles well. Wind handles extremely well. In fact, there was some studies in Florida, it's a great place to study wind damage, after several of the hurricanes in the 90s to look at trees that survived well, and bald cypress was absolutely one of the top. I'm going to drop some links into the chat box that'll let you learn more about that, and you can check out, all of their recommendations based on those studies. But the great thing about bald cypress is it is very tolerant to compacted soils, to poor soils, to drought, to flooding, and to wind damage. It's hardy all across North Carolina. It's native in the coastal plains areas from Maryland through Texas and up the Mississippi River Basin. I think one thing, probably the biggest issue people might have with it, and Barb kind of alluded to, is it's a large tree. So it will eventually get 50, 70 feet tall or more, although it's relatively narrow. So a large tree is going to have a lot of root volume. And so you need to give it plenty of space to grow. And in wetter conditions, it does tend to make a lot of knees, which are the root kind of that stick up above the ground. So in a wet site, you will want to take that into account, not try to grow turf underneath the tree because the knees are going to be there. In drier situations, it doesn't tend to make knees as much, but you always need to be aware that that's a possibility. And the other thing we see that's a little bit different about bald cypress and sometimes causes questions to come into the extension office is the fact that it is deciduous. So even though it's a conifer, it's a needled evergreen, it does lose its foliage and it turns this lovely rusty color in the fall. That usually happens, later in October, November. And especially for people who are from colder climates where a conifer is always evergreen, this can be quite a surprise. So you may get somebody calling into the extension office, ask, or just say, well, my tree is dead. And so that's why it comes back to always being critical to start with identifying the tree. What is it? Why do you think it's dead? What's happening? And I've definitely had that situation where somebody thought their bald cypress was dead because the needles turned this rusty brown color and fell off in the fall. I see in the chat, Marjorie Rayburn shares that in a tornado, they had a huge bald cypress limb come through the window in their house, but the tree survived. So they definitely are very resilient trees. You can learn more about bald cypress and many plants at the Plant Toolbox, which is a wonderful resource that is always growing. And many of our Master Gardener volunteers are contributing to across the state. You can see pictures. You can also learn about that study I mentioned with trees and hurricanes from the University of Florida Extension. And that link is in the chat. And I've put links to a few more of the great resources that Barb's put together, including a more recent publication that was a collaboration with the North Carolina Urban Forest Council on trees and utilities. So lots of great information about tree selection and managing trees around utilities, which is another common conflict. just a couple of quick announcements. Save the date for November 13th. November 13th, we will have our celebration for Search for Excellence. So we had some amazing projects submitted this year, and you will get to hear from the Master Gardener volunteers that were part of these teams and part of these projects on November 13th to learn about what they did and how they did it, and potentially if this is something that would work for you in your county. So that will start at 10 o'clock, and of course it will be recorded. So if you're not able to join in live, you will be able to check it out later. And with our Search for Excellence, there are monetary awards. Each of the winning teams gets $200 to support their extension work in their county. And those funds come through the Extension Master Gardener Volunteer Endowment. And one great and really fun way you can support the endowment is by purchasing a Master Gardener license plate, which does have an additional $20 fee to your normal license plate cost, but $10 of that, so 50%, goes to the endowment when you purchase and then each year that you renew. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And if you are not already subscribed to our Extension Master Gardener Volunteer email list, it is a moderated list, so we do look out for kind of unnecessary messages and try to keep them from coming through. But you can sign up and get announcements about things like the Plants, Pests, and Pathogens webinars and other upcoming events. This is where how I will distribute the follow-up email for today's webinar with all of the links that have been mentioned today. And I will drop that in the chat in just a minute. But just wanted to close out to say that we are about to wrap up our Plants, Pests, and Pathogen season for 2019, and our last one for the year will be next month, October 22nd, and we will have Matt and Mike back with us as our feature presenters talking about current plant, pest, and disease issues around the state. Of course, our sessions are recorded and they are posted on YouTube, and you can go to our index page if you want to see a chronological list all the way back to 2009 and find links directly to all of those recordings. And then, of course, the current schedule, which for this year, we're almost through, is available at go.ncsu.edu/PPP. All right, just the last check of the chat list, and I'm not seeing any questions. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. And happy gardening, and hope everyone has a wonderful fall, and it starts to feel a little like fall by the next time we meet.